Imagine you're 25 years old on International Drive in Orlando. You've recently moved there with your fiance. You filled out application number 200 and something. Same stretch of hotels, gift shops, theme parks. You're told $7.25 an hour. Take it or leave it. You call to follow up and they tell you not enough experience, and this is for a laundry attendant job. Months turn into years. You start believing it's you. Like, maybe you needed more hotel experience. Maybe housekeeping is just too complicated. You weren't trainable enough to pick up a phone or a broom. So again, you blame yourself. Not pretty enough to be the front receptionist. Whatever. Now, imagine going back 16 years later and watching the news panic in real time about a workforce they built their whole business model around, and realizing it was never about what you had or didn't have. All right, guys, welcome back. Let's get into it. I keep watching the news here in Florida, and I can't help but notice something. Almost every headline right now is asking the same question. What are these companies going to do if TPS ends? How will these workers survive? What will happen to the economy? And all I can think is, where was that energy for us? Right? Where was that urgency when Black Americans couldn't find work, and many still can't? Where was the concern when evictions and underemployment, when we couldn't get past the interview stage? When entire communities were stripped of the ability to build wealth? I can speak on this from experience, and truthfully, a lot of FBA women right now are the primary breadwinners in their household and still can't find work. So what are we supposed to do? I lived in Central Florida back in 2009. I spent months trying to get hired on iDrive, or International Drive, for those who don't know. It is the tourist hub of Central Florida. Those months turned into years. Eventually, I convinced myself maybe I didn't have what they wanted. I didn't have hotel experience, and I wasn't willing to work for $7.25 an hour. Not trainable enough for housekeeping or front desk or even a laundry attendant job. I blamed myself, and that blame cost me. I got evicted. I fought for 6 years to hold on to an apartment, and it strained my relationship the whole way through. Here's where it gets interesting. Today, the news is filled with companies openly worried about losing a workforce they built their business around. Per USCIS, Haiti's TPS designation was set to terminate February 3rd this year. A federal court state that on June 5th, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled the government can end TPS for Haiti and Syria with limited court review going forward. Since then, it's been a string of short administrative extensions, first to July 10, then to July 24. As of this week, a federal court appeals panel in D.C. denied the government's request to cut it off early, keeping Haiti's TPS in place through at least July 27, 2026, while the case finishes moving back down from the Supreme Court. And I called this before it happened. I saw this exact pattern of last-minute extensions before this week's ruling even came down. You see, as I'm going through the airport, and as I'm going to the kiosks, and as I go to the concession stands, I am constantly being met with the code switch, where You don't want to assimilate with FBAs, but to save ass right now, you're willing to code switch how you talk. I am watching all of a sudden the down, how you're okay with being mistaken for being a FBA. And it's not luck that I called it before it happened. It's actually muscle memory. That's what happens when an economy has this much riding on a workforce staying in place. Here in Florida specifically, about 158,000 Haitians statewide are protected by TPS, and roughly 113,000 of them work in healthcare. That's not a hospitality sector. That's a chunk of Florida's healthcare. So we talking about the nursing homes, the hospice, as well as the hospitals and the private doctors. And that's with legal expiration dates hanging over it. And nobody's asking what happens to patient care in this state, if that number disappears overnight. If employers knew how to build hiring pipelines and retain workers and organize labor around this workforce, why weren't Black Americans ever included in that pipeline? Why is the sky suddenly falling because the workforce they depended on might change? That tells me something. It tells me they knew exactly how to recruit, who to retain, and how to organize labor when they wanted to. But when Black Americans struggled, the answer was pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Slavery was centuries ago. It's dismissed. There's no emergency, no national discussion, no round tables, no headlines asking, what are we going to do about Black unemployment? No one asked how Black families were supposed to survive. Instead, you're playing the race card. That's what they tell us. You need to work harder. You need to get more skills. Move somewhere else. Stop complaining. And that's the big difference. America economics clearly understands what displacement looks like. It understands that losing work can destroy a family. It understands housing instability and economic insecurity, because that's exactly how the TPS conversation is being framed right now, with urgency and compassion. So you can't tell me America doesn't understand displacement. It clearly does. The real question is who America chooses to care about. My ancestors were kidnapped and forced across an ocean, separated from mother, father, cousin, sister, brother, uncle, aunt. They lost their last names. They lost full names, their languages, their cultures, their freedom. They weren't welcome here. After this day, there was no Ellis Island for them. No gate of welcome, no plaque, no line to wait in. They were bought and sold. Historians estimate roughly 2 million people died during the Middle Passage crossing alone. That's jumping off of the slave ship into the transatlantic slave trade ocean. A figure that varies by source, but every serious estimate is in the millions. Again, our ancestors were the original people violently displaced to build this country's wealth. And it's worth noting, as U.S. citizens by birth, their descendants can't legally be deported from the country their labor built. So ask why that fact never gets centered in this conversation. Why can't we talk about reparations? Generations later, when the conversation turns to repairing that damage, we're told ancient history, you need to move on. That's everyone has problems. When another community faces economic instability, the nation immediately asks, how do we help? That inconsistency deserves to be examined, not to diminish anyone else's hardship, but it is to ask why the same urgency so rarely shows up for the ongoing economic condition of FBAs, right? Why are we constantly looked at as, just come on now, stop that pouting? For context, the historical hierarchy behind some of this isn't just opinion. A historian by the name of Eric Williams documented in Capitalism and Slavery, 1944, how colonial systems assigned different social and economic proximity to whiteness by shade and origin. Later, scholarship on colorism traces how that some immigrant communities position themselves relative to Black Africans after arriving in the U.S. And there's a real audit study data, most notably from sociologist Devah Pager, showing native-born Black applicants faced more hiring discrimination than white applicants, and in some studies, more than immigrant applicants with comparable qualifications. This isn't a personal read, it's a documented read. Florida is flipping out right now on how they're going to handle their workforce if TPS ends, because they have built their entire workforce around immigrant labor. Low wages, working with people who are too scared to stand up for themselves if it came down to reporting to OSHA, or if it came down to unfair labor, or anything like that. Scared of being deported. And so this is why I'm sure I'm not the only one who has a story to tell in that factor of living there. And comment down below and tell me if I'm crazy. Matter of fact, don't tell me if I'm crazy. Tell me if you have also experienced this, where they tell you you don't fit the cultural fit. You literally don't fit the cultural fit. Tell me if you have lived in this environment, and it doesn't have to be in Florida. It could have been in New York. It could have been in Texas. It could have been in Chicago, Minnesota, Ohio, any of the areas where they have large communities where they never assimilated, but yet they seem to have this great ass work ethic because they are getting favorably hired in. And I know that I'm going on a tangent here, but I didn't lack the skills on iDrive in 2009. I lacked a labor status employers couldn't exploit. And this country has never had to build urgency around people who can't be leveraged that way. It's why when slavery ended, they made sure that they wrote strategically everything the way that they did so that Black Americans could not advance. Not the way that they had advancement, not the way that other cultures have been able to come here through Ellis Island and not at the bottom of a slave boat, right? Those people have been awarded privileges. If TPS actually ends, America is going to have to answer questions about race and labor it has spent over 400 years avoiding. Starting with this one, again, why hasn't the same urgency ever showed up for us? If you have watched this video this far and you have not subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe. If you have listened to me rant and just bring my personal point of view to this, leave a comment down below. Leave your thoughts on this, and we'll see you the next time.